What happens when a most feared warriors in the galaxy abandon their sacred duty? What drives a species to flee from danger when they've sworn to protect with their lives? And what kind of creature stands firm when even the bravest turn and run? In a vast Zalarian empire, the Royal Guard are legendary. 10 feet tall, armored in living metal, wielding weapons that can slice through starship hulls. They're chosen from birth, trained from childhood, and have never, in 3,000 years of Imperial history, abandoned their post. Until today. Today, something so terrifying approaches the Imperial Palace that these unbreakable warriors do the unthinkable. They run. Their massive forms thunder through corridors as alarms shriek, leaving behind their sworn charge, Queen Lyralii, last of the royal bloodline. But as the guard's footsteps fade and darkness closes in, a single figure remains. Not a warrior, not a soldier, not even someone from this world. Just a human named Marcus Chun, a maintenance engineer who happened to be fixing a ventilation unit when hell came calling. He doesn't have armor that can stop plasma blasts. He doesn't have weapons that can cut through titanium. He doesn't even have training in combat. What he does have is something the galaxy has never seen before, something that will either save the Empire or doom them all. Because when the most powerful beings in the universe flee in terror, sometimes it takes the smallest act of courage to change the fate of entire civilizations. This is the story of the day humanity showed the galaxy what it truly means to stand guard. Marcus Chun had been elbow deep in the ventilation shaft for 3 hours when the alarm started screaming. The sound cut through the Imperial Palace like a blade through silk, sharp, urgent, and absolutely terrifying. Marcus had heard palace alarms before during his 6 months as a maintenance engineer. Fire alarms were a steady beep. Security breaches were a pulsing tone. System failures were a gentle chime. This was none of those things. This was the kind of sound that made your bones vibrate and your teeth ache. The kind of sound that said something very bad was happening and everyone should probably start running. Marcus pulled himself out of the shaft, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better days. His work uniform, a simple gray jumpsuit with Chun M. Maintenance embroidered on the chest, was soaked with sweat. The palace's environmental systems had been acting up all week, and fixing them in the cramped spaces above the throne room was like trying to perform surgery in a closet. The throne room, where Queen Lyralii would be holding court right about now. Marcus had only seen the queen a few times during his work shifts. She was impressive in the way that all Zalarians were impressive, tall, graceful, with skin that seemed to shimmer between silver and gold depending on the light. But unlike other Zalarians who often looked at humans with barely disguised contempt, she had actually nodded to him once when he'd been replacing a light fixture. It wasn't much, but in a galaxy where humans were considered barely above pets, that nod had meant the world to him. The alarms got louder, if that was even possible. Through the ventilation grate, Marcus could hear something else, shouting. Not the organized shouting of palace guards giving orders, but the panicked shouting of people who had no idea what was happening. He should leave. Every instinct in his body told him to grab his tools and head for the nearest exit. That's what any sane person would do. But something kept him frozen in place, listening to the chaos below. Then he heard the footsteps. Heavy, thunderous, moving fast. The Royal Guard wore boots that weighed nearly 50 pounds each. When they walked in formation, the sound was like a slow, steady drumbeat. When they ran, it was like an earthquake. They were running now. Marcus pressed his face to the ventilation grate and peered down into the throne room. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. The Royal Guard, all 12 of them, were sprinting toward the main doors. These were beings who had sworn sacred oaths to protect the Queen with their lives. Beings who had never retreated from anything in 3,000 years of Imperial history. Beings who were trained from birth to face death without flinching. And they were running like their lives depended on it. Their ceremonial purple capes streamed behind them as they crashed through the ornate doors, leaving them hanging broken on their hinges. The sound of their retreat echoed through the palace corridors until it faded into nothing. In the sudden silence that followed, Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Queen Lyralii sat on her throne alone. She looked smaller than Marcus remembered. Without the towering guards flanking her, without the usual crowd of courtiers and advisors, she seemed almost fragile. Her silver-gold skin had taken on a pale, almost gray hue, and her hands gripped the armrests of her throne so tightly that her knuckles showed white. But she hadn't moved, even as her sworn protectors fled. Even as the palace alarms shrieked around her, she remained seated on her throne with her back straight and her head held high. That's when Marcus saw what had sent the guards running. At the far end of the throne room, the air itself seemed to be wrong. It shimmered and writhed like heat waves rising from hot pavement, but this was different. Darker. There were shadows moving in that distortion, shapes that hurt to look at directly. And it was growing. Marcus had heard stories about the void spawns during his brief orientation when he'd first arrived at the palace. Ancient horrors from the space between dimensions. Things that fed on fear and pain and turned reality itself into a weapon. The kind of monsters that even the Empire's greatest warriors spoke of in whispers. He'd always figured the stories were exaggerated. Everything about the Empire seemed exaggerated to human eyes. Their buildings were too tall, their warriors too strong, their technology too advanced. It made sense that their monsters would be too terrifying to be real. Apparently, he'd been wrong about that. The distortion in the air pulsed, and something that might have been a tentacle or might have been a beam of pure darkness slithered out of it. Where it touched the marble floor, the stone simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not broken, just gone, leaving behind a perfectly smooth cavity that seemed to extend down into infinity. Queen Lyralii watched this with the same calm expression she wore during court sessions. If she was afraid, she didn't show it. But Marcus could see the slight tremor in her hands, the way her breathing had become quick and shallow. She was terrified. She was just too proud, or too well-trained, or too royal to let it show. More shapes emerged from the distortion. They were hard to focus on, as if Marcus's brain refused to properly process what his eyes were seeing. One moment they looked like massive spiders made of shadow and starlight. The next, they seemed like geometric patterns that hurt to contemplate. Then they'd shift again into something that was somehow worse than either of those things. The creatures moved toward the throne with a horrible, fluid grace. Where they passed, reality seemed to fray at the edges. The air turned cold, then hot, then something that wasn't temperature at all but felt like standing too close to an open grave. Marcus should run. He knew he should run. Every survival instinct he possessed was screaming at him to get as far away from this room as possible. If the Royal Guard, beings who could bench press a tank and had never known fear, had fled from these things, what hope did a human maintenance worker have? But Queen Lyralii was still sitting on her throne, still watching the approaching horrors with dignity intact, still alone. Marcus thought about the nod she'd given him. Such a small thing, but it had acknowledged his existence in a way that few others in the palace ever had. He thought about her reputation for fairness, for treating even the lowest servants with respect. He thought about how she'd personally intervened when one of the court nobles had wanted to have a human servant executed for accidentally breaking a vase. She wasn't just the queen of the Zalarian Empire. She was a good person. Maybe the only genuinely good person with real power that Marcus had ever met. And she was about to die alone while her protectors ran for their lives. The decision made itself. Marcus grabbed his toolkit and dropped through the ventilation grate into the throne room below. He hit the marble floor harder than he'd intended. Zalarian ceilings were built for 10-foot-tall aliens, not 5'8" humans, and his ankle sent a spike of pain up his leg as he rolled to his feet. Queen Lyralii turned to the sound, her large, luminous eyes widening in surprise. "Human," she said in accented standard. "Why are you here? You must flee." "With respect, Your Majesty," Marcus said, surprised at how steady his voice sounded. "I'm not going anywhere." He limped over to stand between the queen and the approaching horrors, his toolkit clutched in both hands like a weapon. It wasn't much, a few wrenches, some wire cutters, a plasma torch for welding, but it was what he had. The void spawns paused in their advance, as if puzzled by this small figure that had appeared in their path. One of them, a thing that looked like a living equation written in pain, tilted what might have been its head and regarded Marcus with what might have been curiosity. "You cannot fight them," Queen Lyralii said softly. "Even my guards could not. Your guards could fight them," Marcus interrupted, not taking his eyes off the creatures. "They just chose not to. There's a difference." The queen was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why?" It was a simple question, but Marcus knew what she was really asking. Why stay when he could run? Why risk his life for someone he barely knew? Why choose certain death over certain safety? Because, Marcus said, pulling the plasma torch from his toolkit and checking its charge, someone has to. The lead void spawn made a sound like reality tearing in half and began to move forward again. Behind it, more shapes emerged from the dimensional rift. Too many to count. Too many to fight. But Marcus Chun, maintenance engineer from Earth, son of nobody important, keeper of nobody's expectations, stood his ground. And for the first time in 3,000 years, someone other than a royal guard defended the throne of the Zalarian Empire. The plasma torch hummed to life in his hands, casting blue light across the advancing darkness. It was designed for cutting through metal pipes, not interdimensional horrors, but it was what he had. Sometimes what you have is enough. Sometimes it has to be. The creatures came forward like a tide of living nightmare, and Marcus stepped up to meet them. Behind him, Queen Lyralii rose from her throne for the first time in the encounter, not to flee, but to stand with him. "Together?" she asked. Marcus smiled without turning around. Together. The first void spawn reached them just as the palace alarms finally fell silent, leaving only the sound of Marcus's steady breathing and the queen's whispered prayer in the ancient Zalarian tongue. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. Something that would change the course of galactic history. Something that would make the Empire's greatest warriors question everything they thought they knew about courage. Something that started with a human who refused to run. The first void spawn moved like liquid nightmare, flowing across the marble floor with impossible grace. Up close, Marcus could see that it wasn't really moving at all. Space itself was bending around it, carrying it forward while reality rippled and warped in its wake. Marcus raised the plasma torch and triggered it. The blue flame shot out 3 feet from the nozzle, designed to cut through reinforced steel at close range. It struck the creature's center mass and passed right through it. The void spawn didn't even slow down. "Physical attacks are useless," Queen Lyralii said behind him, her voice tight with controlled fear. "They exist partially outside our dimension. Energy weapons, kinetic weapons, even psychic attacks. Nothing can touch them directly." "Well," Marcus said, adjusting the torch's settings without taking his eyes off the approaching horror, "that would have been useful information about 5 minutes ago." The creature reached him. This close, Marcus could see that it wasn't really one thing, but many, a collection of angles and shadows and impossible geometries that his brain kept trying and failing to make sense of. Parts of it existed in dimensions he couldn't perceive, creating a nauseating optical illusion that made his stomach lurch. A tendril of pure darkness lashed out at his head. Marcus ducked and rolled to the side, his maintenance training kicking in. 6 months of crawling through ventilation shafts and machinery spaces had made him more flexible than he'd been in years. The tendril passed through the space where he'd been standing and struck the marble wall behind him. The wall didn't explode or crumble. It simply ceased to exist in a perfectly spherical cavity 6 feet across. "Okay," Marcus muttered, scrambling to his feet. Note to self, don't get hit by the scary tentacles. More creatures were emerging from the dimensional rift. The air in the throne room was getting colder, and Marcus could see his breath misting in front of his face. Frost was forming on the golden fixtures, and the elaborate tapestries depicting Zalarian history were beginning to fade and curl at the edges. The void spawns weren't just invading this dimension. They were unmaking it bit by bit. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, backing up until he was directly in front of the throne. "You mentioned that direct attacks don't work. What about indirect ones?" "What do you mean?" Marcus pulled a coil of copper wire from his toolkit, his mind racing. "You've got to think like an engineer. If you can't attack the problem directly, you attack the system supporting the problem." Another tentacle lashed out at him. This time he was ready for it, diving behind one of the ornate pillars that supported the throne room's vaulted ceiling. The tendril struck the pillar and carved a perfectly smooth hole straight through 3 feet of solid stone. "The dimensional rift," Marcus called out, peering around the damaged pillar. "That's their anchor point, right? That's what's letting them manifest in our reality." "Yes," Queen Lyralii said, "but the rift is heavily shielded. It would take the combined firepower of our entire battle fleet to what? Destroy it? Close it." Marcus was already moving, sprinting toward another pillar as more tentacles whipped through the air where he'd been hiding. "Or just destabilize it." The Queen's eyes widened as she understood what he was thinking. "The palace power grid. It runs directly underneath the throne room." "Exactly." Marcus pulled his wire cutters from the toolkit and began stripping insulation from the copper wire. Every electrical engineer learns the same basic principle in their first semester. You don't need a lot of power to cause a massive system failure. You just need to put that power in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. A void spawn that looked like a living mathematical proof drifted toward him, reality bending around it like heat shimmer. Marcus could feel the wrongness of it pressing against his mind, trying to convince his brain that what he was seeing was normal, that geometry was supposed to work this way, that up and down were meaningless concepts anyway. He ignored the mental pressure and kept working with the wire. "Your Majesty, I need you to do something for me. See that control panel next to your throne? The one with the crystal displays? The environmental control system? That's the one. In about 30 seconds, I need you to activate the emergency power cycle. It should be a red switch behind a protective cover." "What are you?" Queen Lyralii's question was cut off as another creature emerged from the rift. This one was worse than the others, if that was possible. It looked like a star that had been turned inside out, all burning cold light and infinite darkness wrapped around a core of pure hate. The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. Ice began forming on the marble floor, making footing treacherous. "Marcus," the Queen said, using his name for the first time, "what you are planning is suicide. The power grid carries enough energy to vaporize a building. Only if you do it wrong," Marcus said, making a slip knot in the copper wire. "The trick is not to fight the current, redirect it." He sprinted toward the dimensional rift, dodging between tentacles and impossible geometries. The void spawn seemed confused by his behavior. They were creatures of pure malevolence, designed to inspire terror and despair. Marcus's stubborn refusal to give up was apparently not something they were programmed to handle. The rift itself was beautiful in a terrifying way. It looked like someone had taken reality and folded it in half, creating a crease in space-time that revealed the howling void between dimensions. Things moved in that darkness, things that made the creatures currently destroying the throne room look like friendly pets. Marcus could see why the Royal Guard had run. This wasn't a battle they could win through strength or skill. This was an existential threat to the very concept of existence itself. But every threat had a weakness. Every system had a failure point. And Marcus had spent his entire adult life learning how to find those failure points and exploit them. The palace power grid was a masterpiece of Zalarian engineering. It channeled the output of 3 fusion reactors through a network of superconducting cables that could power a small city. The cables ran through heavily shielded conduits beneath the palace, with junction boxes every 50 meters for maintenance access. One of those junction boxes was located directly beneath the dimensional rift. Marcus dove under a sweeping tentacle and slammed into the marble floor where he'd calculated the junction box should be. The stone was already weakened by the reality-warping effects of the rift. He could see hairline cracks spreading outward from the dimensional tear like a spider web. He pulled a magnetic clamp from his toolkit and attached one end of his copper wire to it. The clamp was designed to hold diagnostic equipment to metal surfaces, but it would work just as well for what he had in mind. "Your Majesty," he shouted over the increasing howl of interdimensional wind pouring through the rift. "Now would be good." Queen Lyralii hesitated for just a moment, looking at the red switch that would cycle the palace's entire power grid. An emergency restart would surge thousands of volts through every circuit in the building for about 10 seconds before the safeties kicked in. If Marcus was wrong about this, the power surge would kill him instantly. If he was right, well, they'd all find out together. The queen flipped the switch. The lights in the throne room flickered and died. For a moment, everything was silent except for the whistle of wind from the dimensional rift. Then, the emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in hellish red light. Then the power surge hit. Marcus felt the magnetic clamp heat up in his hand as thousands of volts coursed through the copper wire. He'd calculated the resistance carefully. The wire would carry just enough current to create a powerful electromagnetic field without instantly vaporizing. The field erupted around the dimensional rift like an invisible explosion. The void spawns shrieked, a sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming children that made Marcus's ears bleed. The creatures began to flicker and fade as their connection to their home dimension was disrupted. But the rift itself held. The electromagnetic pulse had destabilized it, caused it to fluctuate wildly, but it wasn't closing. Marcus realized with growing horror that his plan had only worked halfway. The creatures were being pulled back into their own dimension, but the tear in space-time was actually getting larger, not smaller. The electromagnetic interference was making it unstable, but unstable in the wrong direction. Instead of closing the door between dimensions, he'd broken the lock. "It's not working!" Queen Lyralii shouted over the increasing roar of interdimensional wind. "The rift is expanding." Marcus looked at the copper wire in his hands, then at the growing tear in reality, then at the queen who had trusted him with her life. He'd been thinking like an engineer, trying to solve a technical problem with a technical solution. But this wasn't a technical problem. This was something bigger, something that required a different kind of thinking entirely. This required faith. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice surprisingly calm despite the chaos around them. "Do you trust me?" Lyralii looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. Not as a maintenance worker, not as a human, but as the person who had chosen to stand with her when everyone else had run. "Yes," she said without hesitation. Marcus smiled and wrapped the other end of the copper wire around his wrist. "Then, let's see what humans are really good at." He stepped forward into the dimensional rift. The last thing Queen Lyralii heard before reality exploded was Marcus Chun laughing like a madman as he disappeared into the space between worlds. The last thing she saw was the expression on his face. Not fear, not desperation, but the kind of wild joy that only humans seemed capable of when they decided to do something completely insane. The electromagnetic field collapsed. The palace shook like a leaf in a hurricane. And somewhere in the darkness between dimensions, a maintenance engineer from Earth began the most important repair job of his life. The space between dimensions was nothing like Marcus had expected. He'd imagined it would be dark or cold or empty. Instead, it was everything and nothing all at once. Colors that had no names painted themselves across surfaces that didn't exist. Gravity pulled in directions that hadn't been invented yet. Time moved sideways, then backward, then forgot how to move at all. Marcus floated, or fell, or flew. It was impossible to tell. Through a landscape of pure concept. He could see the mathematical underpinnings of reality laid bare around him like the blueprints of existence itself. Equations wrote themselves in trails of light, then dissolved into music that tasted like the color of his mother's voice. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was completely and utterly wrong. His human brain, evolved for a three-dimensional world with linear time and sensible physics, screamed at him that this place couldn't exist. but it did exist, and somehow he was existing in it, which raised some very interesting questions about the nature of consciousness that he definitely didn't have time to explore right now. Because he wasn't alone here. The void spawns were everywhere, swimming through the conceptual space like sharks through water. Here, in their native dimension, they were even more horrible to look at than they'd been in the throne room. Without the constraints of physical reality to limit their forms, they had become pure malevolence given shape, or rather, given the absence of shape, which was somehow worse. But they weren't paying attention to him. They were focused on something else, something that made Marcus's blood run cold when he realized what it was. The dimensional rift wasn't just a tier between worlds. It was a feeding tube. The creatures were draining energy from his reality, siphoning off the very forces that kept space and time stable. Every second a rift remained open, his universe became a little less real, a little more like this nightmare realm of living concepts and impossible physics. They weren't invading. They were consuming. And if they succeeded, everything Marcus had ever known or cared about would simply stop existing. The copper wire around his wrist pulsed with residual electromagnetic energy, creating a faint field that seemed to repel the worst of the dimensional effects. It was like wearing a life jacket made of physics. Not perfect protection, but enough to keep him from completely dissolving into abstract mathematics. Marcus forced himself to think clearly despite the mind-bending strangeness of his surroundings. He was an engineer. Engineers solved problems by understanding how systems worked and finding their weak points. The rift was a system. It had to have weak points. He began to move through the space between worlds, following the flow of stolen energy back toward its source. The copper wire left a trail of sparks as it cut through the fabric of unreality, marking his path like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. The further he traveled from the rift, the stranger things became. He passed through regions where mathematics had taken physical form, forests of living equations that whispered secrets about the nature of infinity, cities built from geometric theorems that shifted and changed based on the observer's understanding of topology. He saw other rifts, dozens of them, connecting this dimension to countless other realities. Through one, he glimpsed a world where time flowed backward and effects preceded their causes. Through another, he saw a universe where the laws of physics were determined by democratic vote and gravity had recently been repealed by a slim margin. The void spawns have been busy. This wasn't just an attack on the Zalarian Empire. It was an attack on existence itself, a systematic campaign to unmake every reality that had ever been or ever could be. But every campaign had a command center. Every system had a central control node, and Marcus was going to find it. He followed the energy streams deeper into the conceptual space, past regions where color had abandoned light and taken up residence in sound instead, through valleys carved from crystallized emotion and over mountains made of frozen time. Finally, he found what he was looking for. It rose from the unreality around it like a cancer made of pure thought, a massive structure that existed in more dimensions than Marcus could properly perceive. It was simultaneously a building, a machine, a living creature, and an abstract idea, all occupying the same conceptual space without interfering with each other. The heart of unmaking, his mind labeled it, though he had no idea where that name came from. Energy flowed into it from thousands of dimensional rifts, each one representing a reality being slowly drained of its existence. The structure pulsed with stolen life force, growing larger and more complex with each passing moment. And floating around it, tending to it like gardeners caring for some hellish flower, were things that made the void spawns look like harmless children's toys. These were the architects of entropy, the beings responsible for this multiversal holocaust. They were impossible to describe in any language that had evolved in a universe where cause and effect were still friends. They were living violations of everything that was, or could be, creatures that existed solely to ensure that nothing else could exist. One of them noticed Marcus. It turned toward him, or rather, the concept of attention that it embodied focused on his location, and Marcus felt his mind begin to unravel under its gaze. This was what true terror felt like, he realized. Not fear of death, but fear of never having existed in the first place. The thing began to move toward him, reality bending around it like a broken mirror. Marcus's grip on consciousness started to slip as his brain tried to process something that was fundamentally incompatible with the concept of processing. But the copper wire around his wrist pulsed again, and suddenly Marcus remembered something important. He was human. Humans were supposed to be afraid. Fear was their natural state. They'd evolved on a planet that was actively trying to kill them, in a galaxy that didn't particularly care whether they lived or died, surrounded by forces they didn't understand and couldn't control. But they'd survived anyway, not because they were the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, but because they were stubborn enough to keep going even when going made no sense. Especially when going made no sense. Marcus pulled the plasma torch from his toolkit and triggered it. The blue flame sputtered and died in the conceptual space, but the electromagnetic field generator that powered it was still intact. He pulled the device apart with his wire cutters, exposing the field coils within. The architect of entropy reached him just as Marcus jammed the copper wire into the coil assembly and cranked the power output to maximum. The electromagnetic pulse that erupted from the improvised device was tiny by cosmic standards, barely enough to disrupt a radio signal back in normal space. But here, in a dimension where thought and reality were the same thing, where the fundamental forces of physics were just suggestions waiting to be overruled. Here, it was enough to remind the universe that Marcus Chun existed and had no intention of stopping. The pulse spread outward like a stone dropped in still water, carrying with it a very simple message encoded in electromagnetic patterns. This reality belongs to us. We're not giving it up. We're not going away. You want to unmake existence? You'll have to go through humanity first. And good luck with that. The architect of entropy recoiled as if it had been struck. The impossible geometries of its form began to shift and writhe as the pulse washed over it, forcing it to confront a concept it had never encountered before. Absolute refusal to accept the inevitable. Marcus pressed his advantage, pouring more power into the makeshift transmitter. The copper wire began to glow white-hot around his wrist, burning through his skin, but he didn't let go. He couldn't let go. Every human who had ever lived or died or dreamed was depending on him to not let go. The pulse reached the heart of unmaking and struck it like a hammer blow. The structure shuddered. The energy flows from the dimensional rifts began to fluctuate as the stolen realities started to remember that they had a right to exist. But it wasn't enough. The heart was too big, too complex, too deeply rooted in the fabric of unreality to be destroyed by one human with a modified plasma torch and a really bad attitude. Marcus needed help. He looked through the dimensional rifts, searching for any sign that someone, somewhere, was still fighting back. Most of the realities he could see were already in the final stages of dissolution, their defenders overwhelmed by forces they couldn't understand or combat. But then he saw something that made him grin despite the cosmic horror surrounding him. In one particular rift, leading back to a familiar throne room in a familiar palace, Queen Lyralii was standing exactly where he'd left her. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't running. She wasn't even looking particularly worried. She was working. The queen had somehow managed to access the palace's main computer systems and was frantically typing commands into a holographic interface that hadn't been there when Marcus had left. Technical readouts scrolled past faster than human eyes could follow, and Marcus could see energy levels spiking throughout the palace's infrastructure. She was trying to create another electromagnetic pulse, he realized. A much bigger one. But she was making a mistake. She was routing the power through the primary conduits, which would overload the safeties and shut down the entire grid before the pulse could build to useful levels. The Zalarian power systems were too sophisticated, too safe, too well-designed to allow the kind of dangerous feedback loop that Marcus had created with his makeshift transmitter. Unless Marcus looked at the copper wire around his wrist, then at the dimensional rift connecting him to the throne room. then at the heart of unmaking pulsing with stolen energy. Unless someone gave her a way to bypass the safeties entirely. Marcus began to laugh. It was a sound that had no business existing in the space between dimensions, but he made it anyway because he was human, and humans laughed at things that should have terrified them into catatonia. He was about to do something that would either save every reality that had ever existed or destroy them all simultaneously. But at least it would be interesting. Marcus grabbed the dimensional rift with his bare hands and began to pull. The copper wire around his wrist erupted in sparks as he used it to create a direct connection between the heart of unmaking and the Zalarian power grid. Energy from thousands of dying realities suddenly had a new place to go, not into the entropy structure, but back through the rift into normal space. Into a palace power system that definitely wasn't designed to handle the accumulated life force of multiple universes. Queen Lyraliai's eyes widened as every display in the throne room suddenly lit up like a supernova. She realized what Marcus was doing and began typing even faster, reconfiguring the power distribution to handle the impossible influx of energy. Together, separated by the barrier between dimensions, they built a weapon out of hope and stubbornness and the radical idea that existence was worth fighting for. The electromagnetic pulse that erupted from the palace made Marcus's first attempt look like a flashlight battery. It tore through the dimensional rift like the wrath of an angry god, carrying with it the combined defiance of every reality that refused to go quietly into the dark. The heart of unmaking screamed, a sound like every star in every universe going out at once, and began to crack. And in the space between worlds, Marcus Chun held on to a copper wire that was burning through his bones and smiled as the impossible became inevitable. The heart of unmaking died like a star collapsing in reverse. Instead of imploding into a single point of infinite density, it exploded outward into infinite fragments of impossible complexity. Each piece contained the conceptual blueprints for entire universes that had never been allowed to exist, realities that had been conceived but never born, dreams that had been dreamed but never lived. Marcus watched it happen from his impossible vantage point in the space between dimensions, still clutching the copper wire that connected him to sanity and home. The electromagnetic pulse had worked beyond his wildest expectations. Not only had it destroyed the entropy structure, it had reversed the flow of stolen energy, sending power flooding back into the realities that had been drained. Universes that had been fading to gray began to bloom with color again. Dimensions that had been collapsing into mathematical abstractions remembered how to be real. Across the infinite expanse of possible existence, the lights were coming back on. But there was a problem. The destruction of the heart of unmaking had destabilized the entire interdimensional space. The careful balance of forces that kept the realm of concepts separate from the realm of reality was breaking down. Energy was flowing in directions it was never meant to flow. Cause and effect were getting tangled up with each other like knotted fishing line. And at the center of it all, the dimensional rift that connected this chaos to the Zalarian throne room was growing larger by the second. Marcus could see Queen Lyraliai through the expanding tear in space-time. She was still at the computer terminal, still trying to manage the impossible energy flows that were coursing through the palace systems. But the displays around her were flashing urgent warnings in the angular Zalarian script, and even from here he could see that the power grid was on the verge of catastrophic failure. If the rift expanded much more, it would swallow the palace, then the planet, then the entire star system, pulling everything into the conceptual space where mathematics had rebelled against physics and logic had filed for divorce from causality. The heart of unmaking was dead, but its death throes might destroy everything it had been trying to unmake in the first place. Marcus needed to close the rift, but to do that, he would need to sever the connection between dimensions, the same connection that was keeping him anchored to reality. The copper wire around his wrist wasn't just a conduit for electromagnetic energy anymore. It had become a lifeline, the only thing preventing him from dissolving entirely into abstract concept. If he cut the wire, the rift would collapse. But he would be trapped in a space between worlds forever, assuming he could maintain enough coherent thought to qualify as trapped rather than distributed across the conceptual landscape like a very confused equation. It wasn't really a choice. It was just math. One human maintenance engineer weighed against every universe that had ever existed or ever could exist. Marcus had always been good at math. He pulled the wire cutters from his toolkit and positioned them around the copper wire. The metal was so hot now that it was actually glowing, burning through his wrist down to the bone. But the pain felt distant, unimportant compared to what he was about to do. "Hey, Your Majesty," he called out through the dimensional rift, knowing she couldn't hear him, but needing to say the words anyway. "Thanks for the nod." He squeezed the handles of the wire cutters and stopped, because Queen Lyralii was looking directly at him. She couldn't see him. The rift was one way, a window from the conceptual space into reality, but not the reverse. But she was looking at the exact spot where he floated, and her lips were moving in what looked like his name. Then she did something that made Marcus's heart skip approximately 17 beats. She stepped forward and reached into the dimensional rift. "No!" Marcus shouted, the word echoing through the impossible landscape around him. "Don't touch it. You'll be pulled in." But Lyralii wasn't trying to enter the space between worlds. She was reaching for something else, the other end of the copper wire, the end that was still connected to the palace power grid. Her hand passed through the barrier between dimensions like it was made of warm honey instead of crystallized physics. The rift might be one way for vision, but apparently matter could flow in either direction. She grasped the wire with fingers that sparkled with bioelectric energy, a side effect of Zalarian physiology that Marcus had read about, but never seen in person. The moment her hand made contact with the wire, everything changed. The electromagnetic field that had been sustaining Marcus suddenly doubled in strength, then tripled. The copper wire, which had been carrying the power output of 3 fusion reactors, was now channeling something far more potent. The combined electrical potential of 2 nervous systems working in perfect synchronization. Human and Zalarian bioelectricity were completely incompatible under normal circumstances. Different voltages, different frequencies, different basic principles of operation. Trying to combine them should have resulted in immediate catastrophic failure for both parties involved. But nothing about this situation was normal. They were connected through a dimensional rift, operating in a space where the laws of physics were more like friendly suggestions. And somehow, impossibly, their neural patterns were harmonizing instead of canceling each other out. Marcus could feel Queen Lyralii's thoughts mixing with his own, not invasively, but like 2 radio frequencies finding the exact same wavelength. He could sense her determination, her fierce protective instinct for her people, her absolute refusal to let the universe end on her watch. And she could sense him, his stubborn human pragmatism, his engineering mindset that looked at impossible problems and immediately started figuring out workarounds, his deep-seated conviction that existence was worth fighting for even when, especially when, the fight was hopeless. Together, they began to reshape the electromagnetic field around the dimensional rift. Marcus provided the technical knowledge, the understanding of field dynamics, and energy distribution. Lyralii contributed raw power and the kind of fine control that came from a lifetime of using bioelectricity for everything from communication to computation. Instead of simply severing the connection between dimensions, they began to weave it into something new. A controlled closure, like a surgical incision being stitched shut instead of a wound being cauterized. They guided the collapsing rift through a carefully orchestrated sequence of dimensional folds, creating a seal that would heal cleanly without leaving any reality-threatening scar tissue. It was delicate work. It required absolute precision and perfect timing. One miscalculation would tear open a new rift twice as large as the original. One moment of lost synchronization would send feedback cascading through both their nervous systems, probably stopping their hearts. But they did it anyway because someone had to. The space between dimensions began to stabilize around them. The impossible landscape of living concepts slowly faded as the barrier between thought and reality reasserted itself. The architects of entropy, those few that had survived the destruction of their great work, retreated deeper into the conceptual realm where humans couldn't follow. The dimensional rift contracted like a closing iris, reality flowing back into the spaces that had been torn open. Marcus felt himself being pulled back toward normal space, toward the throne room, and the queen who had risked everything to save him. But the transit was rough. The space between worlds didn't give up its prisoners easily, and Marcus could feel pieces of himself being stretched across multiple dimensions as he was dragged back into reality. His consciousness scattered into fragments, each piece experiencing the journey differently. One part of him fell through infinite libraries where books wrote themselves. Another piece swam through oceans of liquid starlight. A third fragment danced with geometric angels in gardens made of pure mathematics. Slowly, painfully like a jigsaw puzzle being assembled in reverse, the pieces came back together. Marcus materialized in the throne room with all the grace of a sack of potatoes being dropped from a considerable height. He hit the marble floor hard enough to crack it, rolled twice, and came to rest in a smoking heap at the base of Queen Lyraliai's throne. Everything hurt. His nervous system felt like it had been run through a blender, then reassembled by someone who had only ever seen pictures of human anatomy. The copper wire was gone, dissolved somewhere in the space between dimensions, but he could still see its pattern burned into his wrist like a brand. But he was alive. He was real. He existed in 3 dimensions plus time, and gravity pointed consistently downward, and 2 plus 2 equaled 4 instead of purple. It was beautiful. Queen Lyraliai knelt beside him, her silver gold skin still sparking with residual bioelectric discharge. "Marcus," she said softly, are you intact?" Marcus tried to answer, and discovered that his vocal cords had apparently decided to take a brief vacation to somewhere in the 5th dimension. He settled for a thumbs up instead. The queen smiled, the first genuine smile he'd ever seen from her. "The rift is closed. The palace sensors detect no further dimensional instabilities." "You did it." Marcus finally managed to make his throat work. "We did it," he corrected. Lyraliai helped him sit up against the throne. The royal seat, he noticed, was now decorated with scorch marks and electromagnetic burn patterns that formed surprisingly artistic spirals across its golden surface. "The royal guard," Marcus asked. "Are they?" "They have returned," Lyraliai said, her expression darkening slightly. "They arrived approximately 3 minutes after the dimensional breach was sealed, along with reinforcements from the palace garrison. They are currently securing the area and conducting what they call a thorough investigation of the incident." Marcus laughed, then immediately regretted it as his ribs reminded him that interdimensional travel was not covered under most health insurance plans. "Let me guess. They're going to take credit for saving the day." "They're the royal guard," Lyraliai said diplomatically. "It is their duty to protect the throne, regardless of circumstances." "Right." Marcus struggled to his feet, accepting the queen's help to stay upright. "Well, I should probably get back to fixing that ventilation system. I've got a feeling the environmental controls are going to be completely fried after all that electromagnetic interference." Queen Lyraliai caught his arm as he started to move toward his scattered tools. "Marcus!" He turned back to her. "Thank you," she said simply, "for staying, for standing guard when no one else would." Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, for what he suddenly realized might be the last time. Tomorrow, the official reports would be filed. The Royal Guard would be commended for their heroism. The maintenance engineer who had jumped into an interdimensional rift with nothing but a plasma torch and a bad attitude would become a footnote, if he was mentioned at all. That was okay. Marcus had never been in this for the recognition. "Your Majesty," he said. "It was an honor." The throne room doors burst open with a sound like thunder, and 12 massive figures in purple capes strode into the chamber. The royal guard had returned, resplendent in their ceremonial armor, their faces set in expressions of grim determination that suggested they were ready to face any threat in defense of their queen. They took one look at the scorch marks covering the walls, the cracks in the marble floor, and the human maintenance workers standing next to their sovereign, and their expressions shifted to something that might charitably be called confusion. "Your Majesty," the guard captain said, his voice echoing impressively from within his ornate helmet. "We have secured the palace perimeter. The threat has been neutralized. Are you unharmed?" Queen Lyralii looked at Marcus for a long moment, then back at her guards. "I'm perfectly safe," she said. "Thanks to my guardian." The guard captain's gaze flicked to Marcus, taking in his singed jumpsuit, his burned wrist, and his general appearance of someone who had recently been used as an interdimensional ping-pong ball. "Your guardian, Majesty?" Queen Lyralii placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. The gesture was small, barely noticeable, but it spoke volumes about where her loyalties lay. "Indeed," she said. While others fled, he stood guard. While others abandoned their posts, he held his ground. And while others chose safety over duty, she let the sentence hang in the air like a sword. The royal guards shifted uncomfortably in their armor. They were warriors who had never known defeat, champions who had never experienced shame. But standing in that throne room, looking at the aftermath of a battle they had run from, they began to understand what both concepts felt like. Marcus picked up his toolkit and headed for the door. He had work to do, and the queen had a point to make to her so-called protectors. But as he reached the threshold, he heard Queen Lyralii speak one more time. "Captain," she said, her voice carrying the authority of 3,000 years of imperial bloodline, "I hereby appoint Marcus Chun as my personal guardian. He will have all the rights, privileges, and responsibilities of that position, effective immediately." Marcus stopped walking. The guard captain's helmet turned toward him with a sound like grinding gears. "Majesty, surely you cannot mean—" "I mean exactly what I said, Captain. This human has proven his worth in ways that others have not. He will guard my person when I deem it necessary, and his authority in that role will supersede your own." Marcus turned around slowly. The queen was still standing by her throne, her expression serene but implacable. Behind her, reality had been torn open and stitched back together, leaving the air itself subtly different than it had been before. "Your Majesty," Marcus said carefully, "I'm just a maintenance engineer. I don't know anything about being a guardian." Queen Lyralii smiled, that same genuine smile she'd given him before. "You know the most important thing," she said. "You know how to stay." And in that moment, Marcus Chun realized that his life was about to become a great deal more complicated than fixing ventilation systems and replacing light fixtures. But it would also be a great deal more meaningful. He nodded to the queen, ignored the flabbergasted stares of the royal guard, and walked out of the throne room to begin the next chapter of his entirely unexpected story. Behind him, Queen Lyralii settled back on her scarred and beautiful throne and began the difficult process of explaining to 12 very confused warriors why a human had just been promoted above them in the imperial hierarchy. It was going to be an interesting conversation. 3 months after the dimensional incursion, Marcus Chun stood in the Palace Memorial Hall, staring at a statue that bore absolutely no resemblance to him whatsoever. The sculpture depicted a heroic figure in gleaming armor, cape flowing dramatically behind him, one arm raised toward the heavens in a gesture of defiant triumph. The face was classically handsome in the Zalarian style. Sharp cheekbones, noble brow, the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved specifically for appearing on currency. The plaque at the base read, "In honor of the Royal Guard's heroic defense against the Void incursion. Their courage in the face of certain death saved not only the Empire, but reality itself." "Artistic license," said a voice behind him. Marcus turned to see Queen Lyralii approaching, flanked by 2 of the royal guards. She was wearing her formal court regalia today, flowing robes that seemed to be woven from captured starlight, a crown that managed to be both delicate and imposing, the works. It was her receiving foreign dignitaries' outfit, which meant the morning had probably been full of tedious diplomatic meetings. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, offering a slight bow. He'd learned the proper etiquette over the past few months, though he still felt ridiculous doing it. "I was just admiring the creative interpretation of recent events." Lyralii glanced at the statue with an expression that suggested she found it about as historically accurate as a musical about singing dinosaurs. The royal guard felt that certain artistic adjustments would better serve the morale of the empire. Right? Because nothing says inspiring like a complete revision of what actually happened. To be fair, the Queen said, a statue of a human in a maintenance jumpsuit holding a plasma torch would have required significantly more explanation. Marcus had to admit she had a point. The official story was much cleaner. The Royal Guard had bravely faced down interdimensional horrors, using their superior training and unshakable courage to drive back forces that threatened the very fabric of existence. The Queen had provided crucial tactical support by coordinating the palace defense systems. Together, they had achieved a victory that would be remembered for generations. The fact that the Royal Guard had spent most of the crisis running for their lives was considered a minor detail, best left out of the historical record for the sake of maintaining public confidence in their protectors. "How are they handling their new reality?" Marcus asked, nodding toward the two guards flanking the Queen. Captain Theron, the leader of the Royal Guard, answered before Lyralii could speak. "We have accepted the wisdom of Her Majesty's decision," he said in the tone of someone who had been practicing that sentence for weeks. "Your unconventional methods proved effective in circumstances that were beyond our experience." It was about as close to an apology as Marcus was likely to get from a 10-foot-tall warrior who had been trained from birth to believe he was invincible. The fact that Theron was even speaking to him directly was progress. For the first month after the incident, the captain had referred to Marcus exclusively as the human and had communicated with him only through intermediaries. "Any word from the dimensional monitoring stations?" Marcus asked. "All quiet," Lyralii confirmed. "No new rifts detected anywhere in the Empire. The architects of entropy appear to have retreated to whatever realm they call home, and our scientists believe they will not attempt another incursion for several centuries, if ever." "Good," Marcus said. "That gives us time to set up better defenses." This was the part of his new job that Marcus actually enjoyed. Over the past 3 months, he'd been working with the Empire's top scientists and engineers to develop early warning systems for dimensional instabilities. It turned out that humans had a knack for detecting the kind of reality distortions that preceded interdimensional incursions. Something about the way their brains process sensory information made them naturally sensitive to changes in the fabric of space-time. The Royal Guard had initially been skeptical of this claim, but a series of controlled tests had proven that humans could detect dimensional fluctuations up to 6 hours before the most sophisticated Zalarian sensors even registered an anomaly. As a result, human reality monitors were now stationed at key points throughout the Empire, serving as an early warning network against future attacks. It was the first time in galactic history that humans had been considered useful for something other than manual labor. Speaking of defenses, Lyralii said, "I wanted to discuss your proposal for the new Guardian training program." Marcus groaned. "Your Majesty, I've told you, I'm not qualified to train anyone. I got through that crisis by making things up as I went along and getting extraordinarily lucky. That," said Captain Theron unexpectedly, "is precisely why you are qualified." Marcus stared at the massive warrior. It was the first time the captain had voluntarily offered a positive opinion about anything involving humans. "Explain that logic to me," Marcus said. Theron's helmet turned toward the statue, then back to Marcus. "We were trained to face enemies we could understand. Opponents with logical motivations, conventional weapons, predictable tactics. When confronted with something that operated outside our frame of reference, our training became a liability rather than an asset. Whereas I had no frame of reference to begin with," Marcus said, understanding. "So I was free to improvise." "Exactly. The Royal Guard needs to learn how to think like humans, how to find solutions that make no sense until they work." Queen Lyralii nodded. "The universe has proven to be far stranger and more dangerous than we previously believed. If we are to protect the Empire against future threats, we need protectors who can adapt to the impossible. Marcus considered this. The idea of teaching the Royal Guard to think like humans was both hilarious and terrifying. These were beings who had been conditioned to follow protocol and respect hierarchy above all else. Getting them to embrace chaos and improvisation would be like teaching fish to fly. On the other hand, the alternative was leaving the Empire vulnerable to the next crisis that fell outside the bounds of conventional warfare. All right, Marcus said finally. I'll design a training program. But I have conditions. Name them, Lyralii said immediately. First, no special treatment, because I'm the Queen's personal guardian. If I'm going to train these guys, I need them to respect me as an instructor, not resent me as a political appointment. Captain Theron's posture straightened slightly. Agreed. Second, the training will be unconventional. We're going to be doing things that probably violate every military regulation ever written. I don't want anyone complaining to you about my methods unless someone actually gets seriously injured. Acceptable, the Queen said. And third, Marcus said, looking directly at Captain Theron, if this works, if the Royal Guard actually learns to think outside the box, you get the credit. I'm not interested in undermining your authority or making anyone look bad. I just want to make sure we're ready for the next time reality decides to get creative. Theron was silent for a long moment. Then he reached up and removed his ceremonial helmet, revealing a face that was scarred from decades of combat and marked by an intelligence that Marcus had previously underestimated. You would do that? The captain asked. Give up the recognition? Marcus shrugged. I never wanted recognition in the first place. I just wanted to keep the Queen alive. Something shifted in Theron's expression, a subtle change that suggested he was seeing Marcus as something other than an unwelcome interloper for the first time. Very well, the captain said. When do we begin? Before Marcus could answer, alarms began sounding throughout the palace. Not the reality-tearing shriek of interdimensional crisis, but the steady pulse that indicated a standard security alert. All three of them tensed, hands moving instinctively toward weapons. Then, Queen Lyralii's personal communicator chimed with an incoming priority message. She listened for a moment, then began to smile. Stand down, she said. It's not an attack. We have visitors. What kind of visitors? Marcus asked. The kind that travel faster than light and arrive unannounced, Lyralii said. The Galactic Council has sent a delegation to investigate reports of the dimensional incursion. Marcus felt his stomach sink. The Galactic Council was the nearest thing the galaxy had to a central government, a coalition of the most powerful species that made decisions affecting entire star systems. They were also notoriously bureaucratic, politically minded, and absolutely convinced of their own importance. If they were here to investigate the crisis, it meant they wanted to either take credit for the victory or assign blame for allowing it to happen in the first place. How much do they know? Marcus asked. Enough to be concerned, Lyralii said. Not enough to understand what actually happened. Captain Theron replaced his helmet and straightened to his full, imposing height. Your Majesty, perhaps it would be best if the human were elsewhere during these proceedings. Absolutely not, the Queen said firmly. Marcus is my personal guardian. He will be present for all meetings regarding palace security. Your Majesty, Theron said carefully, the council representatives may not understand the unique circumstances that led to his appointment. Then they will learn, Lyralii said with the kind of imperial authority that ended arguments before they could properly begin. Marcus looked between the Queen and the captain, recognizing the political minefield they were all about to walk into. The Galactic Council operated on principles of hierarchy, tradition, and species-based superiority. The idea of a human serving in any kind of important role would be completely outside their worldview. But they were also pragmatists. And if Marcus had learned anything during his time in the palace, it was that pragmatists could be convinced of almost anything if you presented the evidence correctly. Your Majesty, he said, permission to speak freely? Always. I think Captain Theron is right. The council representatives are going to have questions about my role here. questions that might be difficult to answer without revealing classified information about the nature of the dimensional threat. Lyraliai's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting that you hide during these meetings? I'm suggesting that we use their preconceptions against them, Marcus said. Let them see what they expect to see. A maintenance worker who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Someone who provided minor technical assistance, but wasn't really involved in the important decisions. While the real story remains classified for security reasons, Theron said, understanding immediately. Exactly. We give them just enough truth to satisfy their curiosity without revealing anything that might compromise our defensive preparations. Queen Lyraliai considered this for a long moment. And you're willing to accept this diminished role? To let others take credit for your actions once again? Marcus thought about the statue in the Memorial Hall, about the official reports that turned him into a footnote, about the months he'd spent watching the Royal Guard receive accolades for a battle they'd run from. Your Majesty, he said, I didn't stand guard to become famous. I did it because it needed to be done. If keeping the real story secret helps protect the Empire from future threats, then that's what we should do. Lyraliai smiled. Not the formal expression she wore for court functions, but the genuine smile he'd first seen in the throne room after the dimensional rift closed. Very well, she said. We will play the roles they expect us to play. But Marcus? Yes, Your Majesty. When this is over, when the council representatives have filed their reports and departed, we're going to have a very long discussion about your tendency to hide your light under a bushel. Before Marcus could ask what that meant, the palace communicator chimed again. Your Majesty, came the voice of the palace majordomo. The council delegation is requesting an immediate audience. They wish to speak with all personnel who were present during the dimensional incident. Tell them we will receive them in the throne room in 1 hour, Lyraliai said. And make sure the Memorial Hall statue is prominently featured in their tour route. As they walked toward the throne room, Marcus found himself thinking about the conversation he'd overheard between 2 junior guards the day before. They'd been discussing the official story of the dimensional crisis, debating whether the Royal Guard's response had been as heroic as the report suggested. I don't know, one had said. Something about it doesn't add up. The captain won't talk about what actually happened, and the Queen keeps giving non-answers when anyone asks for details. You think they're covering something up? The other had asked. I think, the first guard had said slowly, that the truth is probably more complicated than the official version, and maybe more interesting. Marcus hadn't corrected them. The truth was indeed more complicated. It was also more dangerous, more frightening, and more hopeful than any official report could capture. But it was also ultimately simpler than anyone realized. Sometimes when everything falls apart and the experts don't have answers and the heroes run for cover, the solution comes down to one person deciding that running isn't an option. Sometimes standing guard doesn't require training or weapons or special abilities. Sometimes it just requires the stubborn refusal to abandon your post, no matter how hopeless the situation becomes. And sometimes that's enough to save the universe. As they entered the throne room, still decorated with scorch marks from their interdimensional battle, still bearing the scars of the day reality had tried to end, Marcus took his position beside Queen Lyraliai's throne. Not as a hero, not as a legend, not as someone whose statue would stand in memorial halls, just as a guard, doing his job, ready for whatever came next. The council delegation arrived precisely on schedule, their ships darkening the sky over the palace like a swarm of metallic locusts. Representatives from a dozen different species filed into the throne room, each more imposing than the last. They saw exactly what they expected to see: a powerful queen, her loyal guards, and a human maintenance worker who had somehow stumbled into a footnote of history. They asked their questions, reviewed the evidence, and filed their reports. The Royal Guard was commended for their heroism. The Queen was praised for her leadership during a crisis. The human was noted as having provided valuable technical support. The truth remained safely classified. And in the months that followed, as the new Guardian training program began to transform the Royal Guard into something unprecedented in galactic history, warriors who could think like humans, who could adapt to the impossible, who understood that sometimes the best solution was the one that made no sense until it worked. Marcus Chun continued to do what he had always done. He stood guard. He fixed things that were broken. He prepared for the next crisis that would test humanity's greatest strength: their absolute refusal to give up, even when giving up was the only logical option. Because in a universe full of ancient horrors and impossible threats, sometimes logic wasn't enough. Sometimes you needed something much more dangerous. Sometimes you needed hope.